Let's get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephanie Siebisch, and I have the pleasure of being the Margaret and Terry Stent Director of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I wish I was greeting you at McAvoy Auditorium, which was our plan for the symposium around this special exhibition, Alexander von Humboldt and the United States, Art, Nature, and Culture. But then the pandemic got in the way, so we have pivoted, and we now have a lecture series for you. Welcome to the very first one, featuring none other than our senior curator, Eleanor Jones Harvey. And I'll introduce her in a moment. I want to tell you a little bit more about the lecture series because it talks about this singular figure, Alexander von Humboldt. So many aspects to his life and work that we've assembled 6 different perspectives on his incredible accomplishments that are very much with us today. So all of the programs coming up take place at 1 p.m. Eastern time. After Eleanor, featured on September 23rd is Andrea Wolf, the fabulous author of the best-selling book, The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World. It's a great read if you haven't picked it up yet. Following on October 7th, we've got Randall Griffin speaking, from professor of art history at Southern Methodist University, and he will be looking at the influences of Humboldt on American artists, modernists like Georgia O'Keeffe. On October 14th, we have an artist's perspective. Dario Rubletto will be speaking to us, and with a wonderful title for his talk, The Curious Confront Eternity. You can always count on an artist for a good title. October 21st, we see our former Smithsonian colleague in tropical biology, that's Tom Lovejoy, who's now a professor of environmental science at George Mason University. He'll be looking at Humboldt through the lens of climate change. Finishing up the 6-part series, on October 28th is George Steinman, who is an artist, a musician, and a researcher, and looking into the future, looking at Humboldt in relationship to the United Nations Agenda 2030. So a great variety of speakers and perspectives await you. Eleanor Jones Harvey, what to say? We know her well. You may remember her very important exhibition, The Civil War and American Art in 2012, although she's done projects since then. She joined the staff at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in 2003, serves as senior curator. Before coming to SAAM, she spent 10 years at the Dallas Museum of Art. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia, a bachelor's degree with distinction, and holds both a master's and a doctorate degree in the history of art from Yale University. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Eleanor, who's bursting at the seams to tell you all that she's fallen in love with as relates to Alexander von Humboldt. Thank you, Eleanor.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate that. It is a pleasure to have all of you here and to be able to talk with you today about a project that has consumed me for the better part of the last 6 years. I first began working on Humboldt when I was a geology major, ran into him in my historical geology class, and when I switched majors to art history, bumped into him chatting up Frederick Church, the landscape painter in the corner. And although the connections between Church, whose painting of Natural Bridge you see on the screen now, and Humboldt are fairly well known, what wasn't really as well known were the other connections. When I was working on Civil War, I discovered that Humboldt was an ardent abolitionist and had supported John C. Fremont's 1856 presidential campaign. And I began wondering why Humboldt ended up lurking in almost every project I have ever worked on, and what would happen if we made him the focal point instead. And so I began working on that. I found out that he had come to the United States briefly, specifically to meet the 3rd president, Thomas Jefferson. And at that point, I knew I needed to go wherever the leads led me. So what I want to do first is to talk to you a little bit about who is Humboldt. He was a Prussian naturalist in what is now Germany, one of the most widely admired and well-recognized people alive during his generation. He lived to be almost 90. He wrote 36 books, over 20,000 letters, slept about 4 hours a night, called coffee concentrated sunbeams, and traveled over 40,000 miles on 4 continents at a time when most people never left their hometowns. There are features named on the planet for him, over 300 animal species and plant species. There is a mare on the moon named for Humboldt and 2 asteroids, more than for any other human being who has ever lived. He believed in international scientific cooperation and developed the concept of nature that we take for granted today, that there's an underlying unity of nature and that nothing exists that is not connected to everything else. Fortunately, as Stephanie mentioned, we have this wonderful biography by Andrea Wolf focusing on how Humboldt developed his concept of nature. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I heartily recommend it to you. For Humboldt himself, it was his book Cosmos, a sketch of a physical description of the universe that appeared first in 1845, became an instant bestseller, was translated into over 20 languages, and it's the one that made him an international celebrity. But for our purposes, we're going to start a little bit earlier than that. In 1804, after spending 5 years traveling across South America and Mexico, amassing the data that would be the foundation for his life's work, Humboldt took a detour, and he spent all of 6 weeks in the United States. During this time, he invented nothing, discovered nothing, and did not go exploring. And in most accounts of Humboldt's life, this trip is treated a little bit like an airport layover. But the truth is, those 6 weeks shaped the way we think about nature and science and our place in the world. Humboldt's enthusiasm for America charmed his hosts and established friendships that lasted half a century. His first contact is with the man you see here, the artist Charles Willson Peale, who greeted Humboldt on the docks of Philadelphia, took him around the city, introduced him to members of the American Philosophical Society, America's leading scientific society, and then took him to the place that Peale is welcoming us into, his museum. Peale's museum is a compendium of art, natural history, and it's constructed as a civics lesson. So if you look really closely at the portraits at the upper part of the cases, there's George Washington, and he's placed, not accidentally, over the glass-fronted case that contains stuffed bald eagles. A little bit of national symbolism there. Poor Ben Franklin's turkey is waiting to be taxidermied on the floor. It's a place in which Peale assumed Americans would learn about their country, to take pride in its natural features, in its eminent statesmen, and to work with their hands and really understand how the world worked. And it will be Peale who will escort Humboldt to Washington, D.C. to fulfill the object of Humboldt's visit, to meet President Thomas Jefferson. So in preparation for that, Humboldt writes Jefferson a letter. There's an excerpt of it here. He outlines his reason for the visit. He admires American democracy, particularly in the face of monarchical Europe. He's read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, making the case for why America matters. And they both share a fascination with the mammoth, which was then considered the largest terrestrial creature ever known. So what is it about mammoths? As I said, it's found in America, not Europe. It is bigger than any other creature that had been found. We're about 30 years away from finding dinosaurs yet. So for time being, it's the mammoth. Humboldt considered mammoths natural monuments, which will become important for us because he flags something about America that plays to our insecurity at the time. Europe has the 7 wonders of the world, all architectural, all man-made. What Humboldt is saying is, you can't build your way to the top, but what you have is science. What you have is nature. You have natural monuments. You have places like Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls. You've got the mammoth. This is what you build your imprimatur on. And oh, by the way, I can use your data in my writing, so feed it here. So in terms of playing to your strengths, what he also knew was 1802 for the United States turned out to be the year of the mammoth. In 1801, Peale had found the bones and excavated the better part of a complete skeleton in upstate New York and placed it on view in his museum. And then in 1802, you can see the inhabitants of Cheshire, Massachusetts make a mammoth cheese that they put on a flatbed cart and take down to Washington, D.C. to present to Thomas Jefferson, who was known somewhat affectionately as the Mammoth in Chief. Along the way, there was a 9-pound beet that was pickled that was to go along with the cheese. A baker in Washington baked a loaf of bread the size of a human casket to go along with it. There were mammoth egg hunting and egg eating contests. And I want to give a shout out to my colleague Nancy Siegel, who happily provided me with a plethora of mammoth related foodstuffs that went along with this celebratory atmosphere. So Peale's mammoth, which you see here in our galleries, was also a fixture in his museum. It was the thing people flocked to see. It was the calling card that allowed them to take pride in the scale and scope of America's cultural ambitions writ large in this 11-foot tall skeleton. And there, in fact, you can see, connecting with the arrow, the mastodon as it is installed in our galleries, and you can see it peeking out from behind the curtain in Peale's museum. It's an amazing feat on a number of different levels, not the least of which is nobody really knew what a mastodon looked like. This is the first time we had put it together, and Peale made an astute guess and realized that the closest approximation was going to be an elephant. And so he made a copy of an elephant skeleton from a French engraving and used it as what I like to think of as the IKEA instruction manual for how you put together a mastodon. This bone must go here, the ribs go there, and gradually he pieced the whole thing together. The parts that he was missing, he had Philadelphia sculptor William Rush supply, and with the help of his son Rembrandt and also a free black man, Moses Williams, who worked for him, together they put together the armature that would allow them to display the mastodon as a freestanding subject in one of the rooms of Peale's museum. Peale obviously is very proud of this. He shows it off to Humboldt. Humboldt actually knew that it was there, and when they get to Washington, what will also happen is that Humboldt's other reason for coming becomes readily apparent. He is aware of the recent Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and you can see that in the middle of this circa 1800 map, the whole stretch marked Louisiana and Texas, and then the Western Spanish possessions. The Louisiana Purchase is the part marked Louisiana. Well, Jefferson had caught wind of Humboldt's travels through the American consul in Cuba, who set up the transit arrangements. And so he knew that one of the things Humboldt was carrying with him was a detailed map of the Texas to California region of the what would become the United States, that part of the Kingdom of New Spain. And it filled in a lot of questions that Jefferson had about exactly what they had just acquired with Louisiana, but more importantly about the argument that Jefferson was having with the King of Spain over where the location of the border should be between these two countries. And so I want to pop a detail here and point out that in the upper red circle, you can see Santa Fe, New Mexico, what would become Santa Fe, New Mexico in the middle. Down below, the location of one of the settlements of the Comanche Indians. But the thing that Jefferson was most interested in his questions for Humboldt, who lives there? Are there mines? Are there churches? Is it arable land? The other thing he's really concerned about is Spain wants the border where the blue arrow is on the Sabine River that now separates Louisiana from Texas. Jefferson, at Humboldt's urging, was arguing for the Rio Grande, which is the current border between Texas and Mexico, demarcated by the red arrow. So this turns out to be an incredibly important piece of geopolitical intelligence that Humboldt has simply laid out for us to copy. In fact, this map, our copy of Humboldt's map, is now in the Library of Congress's map room and is, of course, in this exhibition. So Jefferson is thrilled. Humboldt has come bearing a gift the likes of which he could not have even imagined. And Humboldt in return is asking for the same kinds of statistics to be sent to him And what he will do is work us into his natural history narratives so that we are part of Humboldt's larger story about how nature works. So before Humboldt leaves, he has written to James Madison, "This country that stretches to the west of these mountains presents a vast area to conquer for science." Humboldt missed meeting Lewis and Clark by only a matter of weeks in 1804. He actually toyed with the idea of taking off after them, wondering whether or not their equipment was good enough to bring back the caliber of measurements he had been making across South America, but was ultimately dissuaded and declared instead that he would come back at a time when he could actually retrace their steps and go and see what was in fact west of those mountains. By the time Humboldt leaves, he has charmed pretty much everyone in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. Peale has come out of retirement and painted the portrait of Humboldt that you see at the top here and installed it in the same run of portraits that includes George Washington and other American luminaries. So Humboldt, the Mastodon, and Peale all becomes part of the same enterprise. And by adding Humboldt to this canon of the people who helped found our country, it's as though he is claiming Humboldt himself as an American. And in fact, before Humboldt leaves, Dolly Madison says, "He is the most interesting traveler we have ever met and is much pleased with America." She really hopes that Humboldt can be convinced either to stay or to come back and live out his life in the United States as an American. The lifelong friendship that Humboldt forges with Thomas Jefferson, reflected in Jefferson's comment calling Baron von Humboldt an ornament of our age, was reciprocated by Humboldt, and the two of them maintained a correspondence until Jefferson's death in 1826. But it's not all about geopolitics. These friendships also fostered the idea that there's an enthusiasm for the American experiment, that Humboldt is rooting for us to win. When he lets us borrow his map, he knows he's going to publish it. He's going to give a copy to the King of Spain. He just believes knowledge is to be shared openly, and why wouldn't he want to give the Democratic Republic of the United States a level playing field on which to enter the international geopolitical stage? But in his writings, he is also equally committed to the idea that nature and art are united in his work. And in Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson pointed out Natural Bridge in his home state of Virginia and Niagara Falls in the state of New York as being two of America's greatest attributes, scenes of wonder that would epitomize that sense of feeling as though this is an amazing country with brand new things to offer. Humboldt will write about both of these features in his books. He will compare them to equivalent features in South America. He will extol Jefferson's wise guidance of the United States. And so by the 1820s, we will make the pivot away from using a mammoth, in this case, a mastodon, and an extinct creature at that, as kind of an avatar for our culture, and pivot instead to using natural monuments, starting with the ones articulated by Jefferson and amplified by Humboldt. By the 1850s, when a lot of American artists are reading Humboldt's Cosmos, the landscape painters will find that fully 1/3 of the second volume of Cosmos is devoted to advice geared strictly for them. There's encouragement from Humboldt, who wrote, "A distinction must be made in landscape painting, as in every other branch of art, between the elements generated by the more limited field of contemplation and direct observation, and those which spring from the boundless depth and feeling and the force of idealizing mental power." In other words, landscape is what you see and the effect that it has on you. And he says, and Frederick Church absorbs this, and these are his two paintings that you see here, both of which are in the exhibition, that an artist needs to know enough science to know what he's drawing, and a scientist needs to maintain a sense of aesthetic wonder in order to appreciate nature. This strikes a chord in the United States because landscape painting is quickly becoming the genre that defines our cultural aspirations. And Frederick Church, who made Humboldt's ideas central to his art, paints those two features and helps popularize them. By the 1820s, the use of these two features is so ubiquitous that in Henry Tanner's map of the United States, he makes them the focal point of the cartouche. Now, this is the earliest map to show the Oregon Territory as a part of the United States. It builds on Humboldt's map and incorporates all of those features. But I want to draw your attention to the cartouche in the lower corner, because here, and I've blown it up, if you look closely, it's got Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls, but they're smooshed together as though Niagara River is actually running underneath Natural Bridge. And effectively what Tanner did was telescoped 800 miles of American topography to bring these two features into the same frame. Now, cartouches in maps often are clues to what the map maker, and by extension the country, believes are important. Next time you look at a map, take a close look at the cartouche. Most of the maps of Europe have cartouches that either are cityscapes or individual architectural monuments that the country of origin is proud in. We are using nature and natural features in order to accomplish the very same thing. So Frederick Church is the artist in America who is probably most deeply swayed by Humboldt's thinking. And his Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls are both classically Humboldtian pictures, merging a scientist's eye for detail and an artist's sense of wonder, all in the same canvases. But Humboldt's book, particularly the Views of the Cordilleras, the frontispiece of which you see here, inspired Church to make 2 trips to South America. He goes the first time with his friend and patron, Cyrus Field, and at night they will be reading Humboldt's words. During the daytime, they will retrace his steps. It is very much a fanboy kind of thing going through the Andes in South America. The hacienda that you see below the frontispiece probably is the one that belonged to Carlos Montefar's family. He was one of Humboldt's friends in Ecuador and a later traveling companion. And Humboldt himself, when he stays there, will see a portrait of Humboldt that was painted in 1802 when the great explorer was there. He will have this copy made by an Ecuadorian artist, Rafael Salas. He will take it back first to his New York studio and then to Olana, where it will stay until it is gifted to William Osborne, one of Church's close friends and patrons, who was a founding member of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. All of Church's works owe a debt to Humboldt, to that acuteness of vision, regardless of where geographically Church happens to be painting. But the Heart of the Andes, the painting that you see here that he completed in 1858, is kind of a summa of Humboldt's credo of the world as one great whole, animated by the breath of life. He meant this as an homage to everything that he had learned from Humboldt. And in fact, he was making plans to ship the painting to Berlin for Humboldt to see when word came of the great explorer's death in May of 1859. Church felt like he had lost a friend, even though the two of them had never met. The New York Times mourned on his behalf, and people flocked to see this painting in order to channel that friendship and to understand the depth to which Humboldt had influenced American art. Now, Church had keyed part of this painting compositionally and from what he included in it, based on Humboldt's very first published tableau with the geography of plants. Very simply put, what Humboldt realized was if he recorded plant life at specific altitudes in the Alps, in the Andes, maybe in the Rockies, in other places, he was finding similar plants at similar altitudes and in similar belts of climate. No one had thought to connect the dots on the world this way. And so what you see in the plant geography map is half watercolor and half Latin names of plants at the altitude at which he found them. The sidebar columns, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, the depth of blue in the sky, corollary information from other places around the globe. This is his first infographic that tries to make sense out of the whole world. And what Church will do is incorporate over 100 identifiable plant species pulled from this map. He will take you from the Amazon River Basin to the top of Chimborazo. It is as though this painting is constructed as a visualization of this particular map. Humboldt's influence in this way inflects all of American exploration following Lewis and Clark. And in this case, you've got the long expedition to the Rocky Mountains, Titian Ramsay Peale, Charles Wilson's youngest son, who grew up on stories of Humboldt's visit. TR was only about 8 at the time. I'm guessing he wasn't paying a whole lot of attention. But every future expedition is going to do 2 things. They're going to take an artist or a photographer along with them. And most of them are going to end up taking Humboldt's published volumes as part of their research library. And on the ship that Long created to get them to the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, they carried an entire shelf that represented all of Humboldt's published works. And then there's John C. Fremont, who is known as the American Humboldt, who takes 4 trips into the American West to help find the passage for railway lines, who will plant flags, and he will name every feature he can after Humboldt. The reason that the Western United States is peppered with Humboldt's name can be laid at the feet of John C. Fremont. The Humboldt River Valley, the Humboldt Basin, the Humboldt Mountains, Humboldt County, California, and by proxy, everything else named for Humboldt, and yes, by extension, Humboldt Fog Cheese. So there is a sense that what we have here is the kind of welling up of interest in Humboldt and in the way that he then takes our information and folds it into his books and makes us significant in his own orbit. This will extend to beyond Fremont to the 3 Great Western surveys in the American West, Ferdinand Hayden in Yellowstone, Clarence King in the 40th Parallel Survey, and John Wesley Powell rafting down the Grand Canyon. All of them are Humboldtians. All of them have surveys that are associated with the Smithsonian. All of them convey the kind of sense that we need to knit the world together, trade information, and build on what we already know. The logical extension of this will come in 1903, when Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, both of whom are Humboldt devotees, meet to discuss in 1903 how to preserve Yosemite. They go on an epic camping trip. You can see them here with the falls behind them. Muir had been influenced by Humboldt for decades, but the 2 of them both believed that educating people to think broadly and deeply and using nature as a way of focusing that knowledge was really important and something that America needed to codify. And so the roots of the National Park System, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the Prairie Reserve are all lodged in Humboldtian thinking about downstream consequences, about planetary stewardship, and about taking care of nature as a restorative place for us as well. The outstanding book on Humboldt's environmental legacy is Aaron Sachs's The Humboldt Current, another book that I would heartily recommend that you take a read for if you've got the time for it, because it's a fabulous journey and it will put American environmental thinking into solid perspective. Humboldt was also deeply influential in American literature. The man you see here is James Fenimore Cooper, and the painting behind him is Thomas Cole's Last of the Mohicans. Fenimore Cooper wrote the bulk of the Leatherstocking stories after reading the Long Expedition report while he was visiting Paris and hanging around with Humboldt. And in fact, it is Cooper and Washington Irving who will spend 3 years with Humboldt in Paris. It will encourage Irving, when he comes back home, to take his only trip west that will start with a tour of the prairies and culminate with the Bonneville stories. They're hanging around with sculptor Horatio Greenough and painter Samuel F.B. Morse in a kind of pro-American Parisian colony in which they are all hanging out together. And in fact, it's Fenimore Cooper's daughter, Susan, who will write Rural Hours, one of the earliest environmental books written by a woman author, with an introduction by her father, one of the eminent naturalists' books published at the time. It probably won't surprise you that Humboldt's influence extends to Emerson on the left and Thoreau on the right, or that Emerson's essay Nature, the concept of the transparent eyeball, are influenced by Humboldt's precept of the unity of nature. Emerson summed up the breadth and range of Humboldt's interests, not to mention his galvanizing personality, when after reading the first volume of Cosmos, he gushed, The wonderful Humboldt, with his extended center, expanded wings, marches like an army, gathering all things as he goes. How he reaches from science to science, from law to law, tucking away moons and asteroids and solar systems in the clauses and parentheses of his encyclopedic paragraphs. Thoreau went the other direction, turning Humboldt's telescope into a microscope, looking at the world in miniature and training it on Walden Pond. And if you read Walden, that amassing of statistics and close observation is like cosmos in miniature, a very personal way of thinking about the world around you being encompassed in, as Humboldt liked to say, being able to see the universe in a single leaf. Walt Whitman will go the other direction and declare himself a cosmos, and in fact was reported to have written Leaves of Grass with a copy of Humboldt's Cosmos on his desk. Certainly the poem Cosmos doesn't appear in editions of Leaves of Grass until after Whitman had encountered Humboldt's work. It's a distinction about an American literary thread that comes through the Knickerbocker writers to the Concord Transcendentalists. There is that arc that follows landscape painting that really talks about place being incredibly important to what it means to be an American and how you think about yourself literally, culturally, personally, and nationally. The great book on this topic is Laura Dassau-Wall's The Passage to Cosmos. She does a magnificent job of weaving all of this into a discussion of Humboldt and early American history. She has also written separate books on Emerson and Thoreau and their interest in American science. Those are also books that were critical to my understanding of Humboldt's impact here in the United States. By the 1820s, Humboldt is saturating American K-12 education. This is the frontispiece of Elmira Lincoln's lectures on botany, and I think you will now recognize the plant geography map, now translated into English, placed as the frontispiece. And it's her signaling that this is going to be the guiding star for the way she is teaching botany and climate in the United States. Elmira Lincoln was Emma Willard's younger sister. She was an eminent author on botany. This is a book that first published in 1829. You see the 1867 edition. We think that there were over 300,000 copies of this book printed and distributed. I picked up a copy on eBay a couple of years ago that was clearly handed down by 3 different women, schoolgirls in New England, who wrote their own notes, pressed plants between its pages, underlined passages, and Humboldt appears as a guiding star throughout the whole thing. It's her older sister, Emma Willard, leaned hard on Humboldt's isothermal lines. Isotherms are a term that Humboldt invented. They are gradients of mean temperature measured in 10-degree intervals. And in this case, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see we're going from Labrador to Boston to Philadelphia to Havana, Cuba. We cross the Atlantic Ocean to Stockholm, Budapest, Naples, and Africa, and then move all the way over to China in the east. And what Humboldt was trying to do was to understand how air and temperature move around the globe to influence our weather. It is quite literally why we have the Weather Channel. Emma Willard picked up on this, and in her isothermal chart drawn from the accounts of Humboldt and others, she and her collaborator, Mr. Woodbridge, created an American geography that was again grounded in Humboldt's plant geography map. If you look closely at this map, you will notice the color-coded bands of temperature, but in the middle there are all of these boxes. It's like a genealogical tree, and in there are the characteristic plants drawn from that plant geography map and where they are located in the different regions. This is the way we are beginning to understand climate science in the middle of the 19th century. Loren Blodgett, who is a climate scientist for the Smithsonian Institution, will take it one step further. This is his map of the annual rainfall in the United States. Humboldt was so thrilled when he received a copy of it that he sent Blodgett this souvenir photograph of himself and a congratulatory letter, which Loren Blodgett cherished. Those are also in this exhibition. In 1829, Humboldt had traveled 1,500 miles across Russia at the behest of the Tsar to determine if there were mineral assets in the Ural Mountains, diamonds, platinum, gold that could be extracted. Humboldt told him, I can tell you that, but it's going to cost you. I want weather stations every 150 miles across Siberia, feeding me weekly information about temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and seismic activity. By 1837, those readings became part of what became known as the Magnetic Crusade, which was an effort to take compass readings and magnetic readings around the globe to understand how Earth's magnetism worked. Alexander Dallas Bache, head of the Coast Guard, set up a station at Girard College in Pennsylvania. And by 1837, Humboldt had stations around the globe, with the exception of the middle of the oceans, feeding him data on climate and magnetism, which would inform his and other scientists' work. Humboldt himself is a bit of a magnet. And in fact, when he leaves the United States in 1804, Thomas Jefferson sends him back to Europe with a letter of introduction to one of his best friends, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette writes back to Humboldt after about 2 years saying, oh my God, we are such good friends. Thank you so much for the introduction. This is awesome. And by that time, another man who was in their orbit in Paris was Simón Bolívar, the man who is considered the liberator in South America, who believes he was inspired by Humboldt to go back home and liberate his home country of Venezuela, along with other South American countries, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador, from Spanish colonial rule. The three of them, Humboldt, Lafayette, and Bolívar, became the three leading revolutionaries in Paris. United by their admiration of Jefferson and American democracy, and by their disgust over the increasingly imperial tendencies of Napoleon. And in fact, all three of them will skip Napoleon's self-coronation. He will get angry. He will refer to them as spies. He will try to kick them out of the country. But the camaraderie is one of the things that makes Humboldt such a magnet for every American traveler headed to Europe. In 1814, Humboldt will be part of the Prussian delegation to the Treaty of Ghent, which officially ends the War of 1812. And Humboldt is there to advocate on behalf of favorable terms for the United States. It is then he meets the American delegation, his old friend Albert Gallatin from his days with Jefferson, along with John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Adams will make a side trip to Paris, and the two of them will sit together in the French scientific lectures, listening to all of the talks as part of the French scientific community. It's at this time that Humboldt also develops a close friendship with the American artist and inventor Samuel F.B. Morse, who is in Paris painting the studies for this monumental painting called the Gallery of the Louvre. And oh, by the way, that's Susan Fenimore Cooper in the foreground taking art lessons, because again, this is all very much a matter of mutual friendships. Humboldt ends up climbing on the scaffolding and distracting Morse. Fenimore Cooper writes about it in his diary that he will look at Morse and say, you look tired, let's go walk the galleries, and then say, tell me about the telegraph. Because what Humboldt is more interested in is the idea of instantaneous communication without the interference of monarchs, the censorship of the mail, ships going down at sea, not hearing from someone for over a year and wondering if your letter ever got through. And so when it's time for Morse to debut the telegraph, he will take it to Paris, where Humboldt and his best friend François Arago will help introduce it to the French scientific community. And it is Humboldt who will declare to Morse, whose philosophic and useful labors have rendered his name illustrious in two worlds, the worlds of art and the worlds of science. You'll notice in the lower corner, there's Morse on one side and Cyrus Field on the other. Remember him? He was Frederick Church's patron. Well, the two of them will go into business to create the transatlantic cable after Arago here on the left and Morse also end up together, because it's Arago who will introduce Morse to his best friend, Daguerre, the photographer, helping to inspire and amplify Morse's interest in photography as part of his career. When Morse and Field go into business to create the transatlantic cable, it is an endeavor that is fraught with difficulty trying to lay a cable across the base of the Atlantic Ocean. Matthew Fontaine Maury, known as the Pathfinder of the Seas, will create the plateau, the route map where it will go. Humboldt is cheering him on from the side. And Cyrus Field, being the funder behind all of this, plays an adjunct role really in the story behind the Aurora Borealis, the painting that you see here by Frederick Church, which spans from Newfoundland on the east to Ireland on the west, further east, the actual arc of the transatlantic cable. And it's been noted by Lauren Applebaum, one of my colleagues, that the electromagnetics in the sky seems to resemble the snapped pieces of the cable as Field tries to lay it from one side of the Atlantic to the other. So from literal electromagnetic impulses to the cable, there is this notion that cosmos is also about networking everything together, something that Humboldt obviously felt very deeply connected to. But it's here also that we pivot to Humboldt's humanitarian concerns. I mentioned at the beginning that Humboldt was an ardent abolitionist. As he wrote, all races are in like degree designed for freedom. He wrote that he really felt that the law that allowed people to be enslaved needed to be repealed, that the flaw in American democracy was the inability to abolish slavery. And to William Thornton, one of Jefferson's best friends, he wrote, "This abominable law that permits the importation of Negroes to South Carolina is a disgrace for a state in which I know many level-headed people to live. Conforming to the only course of action dictated by humanity, undoubtedly less cotton will be exported at first, but alas, how I detest the politics that measures and evaluates the public welfare simply according to the value of its exports. The wealth of nations is like the wealth of individuals. It is only secondary to our happiness. Before one is free, one must be just, and without justice, there is no lasting prosperity." He wrote a letter decrying Daniel Webster's fugitive slave law, which was printed on a card by a New York businessman and distributed to Union soldiers in 1864. The copy you see here was sent to Abraham Lincoln, along with a note from the businessman saying, "I know you're familiar with Humboldt's words. They must bring you comfort at a time like this." Frederick Douglass was also deeply involved with Humboldt's writings and published columns on Humboldt in his paper, The North Star. In 1804, when he came to the United States, Humboldt had written to James Madison, after having witnessed the great spectacle of the majestic Andes and the grandeur of the physical world, "I intended to enjoy the spectacle of a free people worthy of a great destiny." It's a not so subtle dig about that issue of freedom. And in fact, while he is visiting the United States, Humboldt goes to Mount Vernon, which you see here in a painting by Eastman Johnson, which focuses not on the magnificent view from the portico across the Potomac River, but on the slave quarters that are attached to the main house, the engine of the entire enterprise, in which, and here is a detail, every person depicted is Black. Humboldt is interested in talk about George Washington, who had died 5 years earlier, but he really wanted to meet William Lee and any other former enslaved person who had been alive while Washington was alive. He wanted to understand that part of the American experience. In light of the ideals expressed by the Declaration of Independence, he wanted to understand how we could square that circle. And in 1825, Humboldt will write to a good friend of his that he fears that if the United States cannot address this lingering evil, it will tear the country apart. As a result, it should come as no surprise that Humboldt will support John C. Fremont's 1856 presidential campaign as the first Republican candidate separate from the Whig Party. You see here an ambrotype with one of his slogans, Fremont and Freedom. When he loses to James Buchanan, Humboldt is devastated and worries that all of the years that he has spent nattering at Americans about the need to abolish slavery will continue to fall on deaf ears. But Humboldt's humanitarianism is not just about slavery. He also hates colonialism and oppression. Referring to the calendar stone that you see here that he studied in Mexico City, Humboldt observed, "A people whose festivals are arranged according to the stars and whose calendar is engraved on a public monument probably had a higher level of civilization than is granted by those clever historians who have taken America as their subject. These sharp distinctions between barbaric and civilized nations are unacceptable." He encouraged his protege, Prince Maximilian Zuvide, to hire the artist Karl Bodmer and travel to the United States, partly to go ahead and retrace the steps of the Lewis and Clark expedition, check the measurements, collect the natural history, and meet with and talk to the American Indians that he encountered along the way. But it was also an effort to create an ethnographic treatise on North American Indians to rival the work Max had done in the Portuguese colony of Brazil with the Botocudo earlier in his life. The two of them will end up spending a tremendous amount of time with the Mandan Indians up along the Missouri River. There will be vocabularies, there will be listings of rituals. The two of them became very close friends with Matatope of the Mandan and the man you see here, Pariskarupa of the Arikara. And in the year that they spent with them, wrote out histories and observations that to this day form some of the most important information that we have on these nations. They were traveling along the same route that George Catlin had traveled the year before. Catlin had spent 6 years creating portraits of American Indians in response to Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. In the 1840s, he brought his paintings, a tremendous number of Indian artifacts, to Europe, first to England and then to Paris. In Paris, he brought with him a troop of Iowa Indians that he had met in the 1830s in their villages. They were in London. They were willing to travel to Paris with him. They performed their native ceremonies. One performance for King Louis Philippe at the Tuileries Gardens, and then in a salon that had been set aside for them in the gallery of the Louvre. It is there that they met Alexander von Humboldt. And Humboldt, using the translator that they had with them, ended up meeting for the first and only time in his life the North American Indians to balance out the experiences that he had had with the indigenous peoples in South America and Mexico during his 5 years earlier in his life. Their shared revulsion for Jackson's Indian Removal Act is something that was caught up in Theodore Parker's observations. He was a Massachusetts abolitionist who noted, Humboldt always takes the side of the Indian in North or South America over his oppressor. By the 1840s, Humboldt is one of the most widely admired people alive. He attracts intersecting networks of colleagues and admirers from a broad variety of fields, including the man you see here, British chemist James Smithson. They first met in 1790, before Humboldt had even come to the United States, at the Royal Society in London. And then their paths cross again in 1814 when Smithson spends almost a year in Paris. And after a number of boozy dinners with the Société d'Hercule in the Bois de Boulogne, Humboldt and Smithson and Francois Arago become very close friends. And in fact, it is Arago who will stage an intervention when he becomes alarmed about James Smithson's gambling habits. James Smithson's major gamble would be to change his will and to declare that if he died without heirs, legitimate or illegitimate, that his entire fortune would be given to the city of Washington to found an institution bearing his name for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men, an institution that Humboldt would come to call the Admirable Smithsonian. This venture will create an institution that is effectively devoted to expanding on all of Humboldt's key ideas. And as a result, I'm increasingly aware of Humboldt's fingerprints on nearly every aspect of American culture, and by extension, on every facet of the Smithsonian. From arts to sciences to cultural museums to outreach, we span the globe, we try to knit it all together. The deeper I dig, the more I'm convinced that this institution is in some ways the concrete manifestation of Humboldt's brain. Echoes of his ideas, his theories, his observations, and his discoveries that are as relevant now as they were 2 centuries ago. Humboldt's cosmos merges rational, empirical science with aesthetic appreciation. Or, to put it in Humboldt's words, the stars, as they sparkle in the firmament, fill us with delight and ecstasy, and yet they all move in orbits marked out with mathematical precision. I believe we are living at a moment when Humboldt's ideas are once again tied to the major concerns that we face with regard to human rights, cultural literacy, and as stewards of this planet. And I hope that you'll find ways to embark with us on this journey, either in person or in our programs online. As Ralph Waldo Emerson noted, Humboldt was like one of those wonders of the world who appeared from time to time as if to show us the possibilities of the human mind, the force and range of our faculties. He was a universal man, every bit as relevant now as then, maybe even more so. I'd like to thank you for being a part of this lecture and webinar, and I would be happy at this point to address some of the questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. That was absolutely fantastic and riveting. And as one of our viewers said, wow, so many dots of our experience connected in one lecture. So thank you so much for that. We already have some questions about Humboldt and about your lecture. And I'd like to kick off with one that really encompasses the whole concept of Humboldt. What did Humboldt mean by the unity of nature? And go ahead.
What he meant by the unity of nature was everything is interconnected, that there is nothing that stands apart from anything else. And I mean, to us, that sounds pretty obvious, the idea. I mean, we're taught about ecosystems and biomes and downstream consequences. If you've taken any environmental science, if you read the science section of your newspaper or something, that seems really, you know, kind of like it's a no-brainer. But for Humboldt, he's really the first person to kind of start making astute guesses about those things. I will say, for instance, his plant geography map, which was made in 1804, based on what he saw at different altitudes in the Andes and in the Alps, we're still using that map 200 years later to understand how climate change has meant that those species are moving around on the mountain, that they are now able to live at higher elevations because the snow and the ice have receded. And so we're using it as a benchmark. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, sort of owes its soul to Humboldt, that notion that if you understand all of the variables, that if you recognize that maybe that DDT is in fact the culprit in making birds' eggs so fragile that they can't hatch properly, and she helps rescue the bald eagle, because by removing DDT from our environment, eagles' eggs become stronger, baby eagles hatch, and suddenly we're not on the endangered species list anymore. So I think his legacy is that notion that everything affects something else. We talk about the butterfly effect, where a butterfly flaps its wings and the weather changes in you know, halfway around the globe. That notion that everything that happens kicks other things into motion and is influenced by other things is really what kept Humboldt up late at night.
So you sort of touched on this, but the second part of that question was, did he ever use the phrase web of life, one that we use today, and if so, where?
He did use web of life. And again, you know, part of it has to do with the fact that we read Humboldt in English, we read Humboldt in translation. And in fact, because it was Cosmos was translated into over 20 languages, there are differences in the actual terminology that is used, but I believe Andrea Wolff uses the term web of life in her translation of Humboldt from the original German and French. And so I defer, when she speaks next week, we'll have to quiz her on that. But I think that, yes, he did see everything as an interconnected web. And I think web is a good term because it's not linear. It's all interconnected, it's interwoven, and it's very much that kind of tapestry.
Great. You talked a lot about Humboldt's different relationships with people throughout the United States and throughout the world, actually. And then you also touched on his ardent abolitionism. And so folks wanted to know, what was Humboldt's reaction to Jefferson as a slave owner when Humboldt himself was such a committed abolitionist?
Humboldt is definitely, particularly early in his career, he is very diplomatic. The gloves come off the older he gets. So with Jefferson, he's actually afraid when he gets to the United States, he's not important enough for Jefferson to make time for him. And after Jefferson invites him into the White House, says, you know, come and hang out anytime, you know, let's have dinner, let's stay up late, let's talk about this. Humboldt says, no monarch in Europe has ever treated me the way Jefferson did. So there's a tremendous amount of almost familial respect, but it's very clear slavery really bothers him. And so he won't tackle Jefferson head on about it, but he will harangue everybody in Jefferson's orbit as if to try to get to him by proxy. I wish he had, I mean, if he tackled him head on, he did it verbally, and we don't have a written account of it. My guess is he probably needled him about it, but probably didn't actually body slam him about it. He did actually get a lot more traction out of Jefferson on the issue of America's relationship with Native American nations. He writes to him and he says, I certainly hope that you are planning to figure out how to treat these people as equals. Jefferson starts his presidency by saying, we won't take an acre of their land without their permission. They are sovereign nations. We will figure it all out. And by the end of his second term, he's pretty much changed his tune with the addition of Louisiana. He's got territorial governors perched out west who are freaking out. And I think in order to appease them, his rhetoric becomes a little bit more harsh in terms of we can crush them if we have to. So he sends Meriwether Lewis out west saying, get us ready to negotiate treaties so that we can cross their land and get to where we need to go, as if we are all going to be partners. And the partnership is clearly not working in his mind by the end of that. And Humboldt is going to be exceedingly frustrated with this. It's going to bedevil him with every connection he has with an American politician or statesman. And in fact, up until 3 months before he dies, Americans visiting him in Berlin are going to get harangued about the issue of slavery. It's 1859, we are going to tip into civil war, and Humboldt's going, I love you guys, I think of myself as half an American, but the half he is holding back is the half that will not go along with slavery.
Wow, impressive. He was so influential in his thinking. So
I think he wished that, I mean, I think that's the place where we dug in our heels and said, love ya, but we're not going there. And it's the one place where he could not get traction and it drove him nuts. You know, it's like, you listen to me about all these other things. What is your problem? And I think that particularly as we get through the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, he's just kind of like, I'm done. I'm done being diplomatic. I'm done being nice about it. I'm just going to let you guys have it. And, you know, it's whether it's in Europe or in America, he is really coming down on the side of, as he said, you know, without justice, there is no prosperity.
I think you just answered, we had someone who asked, how do you think that his humanitarianism and contestations to colonialism and the treatment of indigenous people complicated his enthusiasm for the American project? And was that enthusiasm largely in the service of advancing his own scientific projects, or were his thoughts on this more complex?
I think they're more complex than that. I mean, I think, yes, he definitely saw, I can add an entire unknown continent to the sum total of the world's knowledge of the earth. And yes, this is going to be great. But he's also farming stuff out and collaborating with other people. So it's not like he's holding it close. He really wants it factored into everything. I really do think that he is like an Enlightenment omnivore who is just insanely curious about everything. I do think that the way that, I mean, his commitment to civil rights does not sway. He is, when he wrote up his narrative on traveling through New Spain, he hammered on the ill effects of colonialism. He said pre-Columbian civilizations were once great civilizations that have been beaten down by generations of Spanish rule, and this is horrible. I mean, it's a wonder. I mean, I'm sure the King of Spain had second thoughts after he got back going, I let the guy go in there and this is what I get back along with my data. So I don't think that Jefferson was under any illusion about the fact that Humboldt could have clearly done exactly the same kind of thing to him. I think that for Humboldt, he so wants American democracy to become a new model to overwhelm and replace European monarchies. And so his friendship with Lafayette, the friendship with Bolivar, the support for the revolutions of 1848, this is a guy who really wants monarchies dead. And so he is willing to forge alliances that he thinks are going to facilitate that. I will say something else. I mean, we live in an extraordinarily polarized age. Humboldt is an object lesson on how never to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It is as though he may hate you as a human being, but if he admires what you did, he will cherry pick what you did and then grouse about you as a person. But he won't discount the value in what you said just because of who said it. And this business of, I can't accept that because it's being articulated by someone whose politics don't match up with mine, he's like, you know, that would kind of negate half the world's, you know, source of information. So it's interesting watching him weave this path between, I love your research, I disagree with your conclusions, you're a vile human being, but as long as I've got your data, I can use it for something better and that will be fine. So, I mean, there's kind of, I spent a lot of time while I was writing this book thinking about whether or not we as a country could, would, or would want to ever get back to that kind of, that level of civility. And I think the way Humboldt squares it is, he had such a sharp, sarcastic tongue that at all of the Parisian salons, the joke was, which wasn't a joke, everybody was afraid to leave before Humboldt did because they knew that he would start saying snarky things about them the second they left the room. And so he would walk into the salon at, you know, one of his translators and would start telling stories about the people who weren't there. So this is a guy, who was it who said he had the kindest heart and the most slanderous tongue of any human being I've ever met.
Such a force to be reckoned with.
He definitely gets a seat at my cosmic dinner party across time, yes.
Well, and then you would have to wait until he left before you could get up. So you might be there for eternity.
Exactly.
We have time for one more question. This has been fantastic, and I really appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge. I'm going to take it back to art, since we are the Smithsonian American Art Museum after all. And you talked a lot about church and Humboldt's influence on him. Can you talk about some of the other Hudson River School artists or other artists in general that Humboldt influenced?
Yeah. I mean, the three artists that I ended up focusing on the most in this exhibition were Charles Willson Peale, who obviously had the benefit of meeting Humboldt and essentially falling for him. It's like, oh my God, Peale saw his museum really as the precursor to the Smithsonian. He asked Humboldt to ask Jefferson, buy me out, bring this to Washington and make a national institute. That would be awesome. Peale comes out of retirement because of Humboldt. He is so inspired by having him there that he paints his portrait, he paints the exhumation of the mastodon, he paints the artist in his museum, drives his kids crazy. And so he becomes a kind of, it's a second wind for his career and really his whole reason for doing a museum. For Frederick Church, it's like the distant mentor he never meets, but is totally enamored with. And I find it interesting that, you know, Church does not go to Europe until the 1860s, long after Humboldt is dead. He does not, in fact, you know, rearrange things to say, I have to go meet this guy. But he does absorb everything he can about his books. They're at his library at Aulana. He had access to the big expensive volumes in his patrons' libraries. And really, one of the critics said that Church is the painter that Humboldt so longs for in his writings. And he sets Church up as, you know, the painter's version of the American Humboldt, the man who Church later on will write in a letter to a colleague, I wish science would take a 10-year holiday so that I could catch up. So it's that notion of wanting to know everything about everything and having the hand-to-eye coordination and the vision to make it all come alive. And then interestingly, with Samuel F.B. Morse, he will, of course, give up his painting career after the Gallery of the Louvre is a colossal disaster, and he will, turn to inventing. And, for Humboldt to console him by saying, that's okay, you're actually a master in two worlds. I think it's this respect for understanding that it's the way you treat adversity that matters. And for Morse, it depressed him that he was no longer going to be an artist, but then it was kind of like, all right, we're going to invent stuff. And his photographs, his telegraphs, the work on the transatlantic cable, I mean, it's pretty amazing stuff. When I found out that he had inspired Karl Bodmer's trip to the American West with his patronage of Prince Maximilian, that really was a game changer, because what it said to me was that I needed to look into American exploration in order to see how art formed a corpus. There's a whole nother show that you could do just on art from explorations, the Long Expedition, the Wilkes Expedition, the Great Western Surveys. The visual record from that is extraordinary, and it all is driven by Humboldt's sort of ability to do both the analytical and the artistic end of what he does. So I think that for us, the Hudson River School in general, there's sort of a level of kind of saturation. It's what's already in the water, so to speak. I mean, Thomas Cole is not really a Humboldtian, but there's clearly, through Emerson and through Cooper, a lot of Humboldt by proxy that ends up in his work. It's really Church who flags it and runs with it. But I expect that it's not that difficult to look at almost all of the Hudson River School artists' work, particularly Kensett, Whitridge, Gifford, and really see that dedication to close looking and astute observation, that delight in nature, that sense of revelation that comes through as being something that they share with Humboldt.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. This has been really fun and really informative. As Stephanie mentioned at the top, we are opening our doors back up, so please go reserve your tickets on our website and go visit it in person. And also you can sign up for the rest of the series of talks. Next week will be Andrea Wolf, and you can find all of that information by signing up for our newsletter, as just dropped in the chat, or at americanart.si.edu. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you again, Eleanor, and thank you, Stephanie, for your time in introducing us earlier this afternoon. Take care, everyone.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.